The pace and scope of climate change may seem uncertain, but the fact that it is occurring is not. Global institutions, governments, and the scientific community are in agreement. The Earth is warming and will continue to. This is indisputable. What is also clear is that climate change will directly and indirectly affect the health and well-being of human populations. A recent risk assessment from the World Health Organization estimated that approximately 250,000 additional deaths will occur due to climate change per year between 2030 and 2050. That is 5 million premature deaths over this 20-year period. And this is a conservative estimate because the authors of the WHO report could not quantify certain pathways such as coastal flooding. This climate-induced burden of mortality will not be equally shared by the Earth's inhabitants. The old and young will be especially vulnerable. According to the WHO assessment, in the year 2030, we can expect 38,000 additional deaths among the elderly due to heat exposure, 48,000 additional deaths due to diarrhea, 60,000 additional deaths due to malaria, and 95,000 additional deaths due to child undernutrition. Some regions of the world are more at risk than others when it comes to these impacts. These regions tend to be less developed. For example, it is estimated that by 2030, sub-Saharan Africa will have the greatest burden of mortality attributable to climate change. But 20 years later, in 2050, we can expect that South Asia will have the greatest burden of mortality. These kinds of assessments carry a degree of uncertainty given the limitations of the models they use, but even so, they provide a sense of the stakes involved when it comes to global climate change over the next century. At the center of these scenario-based predictive models are a variety of pathways by which climate change is seen to directly or indirectly impact human health. These pathways include direct exposure to harm from extreme weather events such as floods, storms, and heat waves, as well as indirect exposures that arise as regional ecologies are altered, diminishing agricultural productivity, or facilitating the spread of infectious vector-borne diseases such as malaria, already one of the world's leading killers. Climate change will also impact the social and economic conditions that we know are so vital to health and well-being. Many of the social determinants of health that we know shape life chances will be impacted in one way or another by climate change. One pathway that is not highlighted in your textbook by Gatrell and Elliott is the relationship between climate change and violence. Violence is a major cause of death and injury in society, and is thus an important concern when it comes to population health. Yet it is too often overlooked or underconceptualized in health and medical geography. This is a point made by geographer Jeffrey Durvitay in a recent paper in the journal Social Science and Medicine. He frames violence in three ways: interpersonal, structural, and collective or mass intentional. Interpersonal violence is the physical violation of a person's body by another person. This type of violence occurs between individuals in the context of their everyday interactions and settings. Structural violence, on the other hand, is more abstract. It encompasses forces such as poverty, racism, and socioeconomic inequality that prevent people from meeting their basic needs, leading to premature death. Finally, collective or mass intentional violence is the use of deadly force against an entire group by another group. In this category, one would find a range of examples, from warfare between nation-states, internal conflict among factions typical of civil wars, and genocidal actions towards specific ethnic or religious minorities. Given the significance of violence in terms of population health, its relationship to climate and weather is of vital importance. This begs the question: does climate change cause or contribute to the risk of violence? The specter of so-called climate wars has led many researchers from across the humanities and social sciences to consider this important question. In a recent paper in the journal Health and Human Rights, Barry Levy and Victor Siddell answer unequivocally in the affirmative. In their review, they find that climate change impacts are causally associated with collective violence on a scale that threatens health and human rights. In their review, they find evidence in both historical studies and modern era studies of climate change effects. In the pre-modern era, climate change was a major driver of armed conflict and humanitarian crisis in the Northern Hemisphere. In the modern era, research has shown that increases in temperature, such as those that occur as part of the El Niño effect, as well as decreases in rainfall and water scarcity, increase the probability of conflict and violence. Levy and Siddell draw on a wealth of research in their paper, but some of the most compelling is the work of Solomon Hussain and Marshall Burke. In a recent paper, they review 50 independent and credible quantitative studies to determine the extent to which climatological changes cause conflict and social instability. In their analysis, they define conflict and social instability as, quote, events where regular patterns of dispute resolution fail or social orders change, end quote. They found strong support for a causal association between climate change and social conflict, but more compellingly, they found that this association is generalizable to regions around the world, occurs whether the climate change is rapid or gradual, and spurs conflict at a variety of different scales, from intimate spatial scales such as neighborhoods to the scale of the entire globe. The implications of this, according to Hussain and Burke, is that if people behave like they have in the past, then the climate scenarios predicted with today's models will increase the risk of violent conflicts for most populations in the tropics and subtropics. According to some, this risk is already manifesting in the world today, in the form of interpersonal, structural, and collective violence. In Christian Parenti's book titled Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, he describes what he calls the catastrophic convergence of political, economic, and environmental disasters, where the impacts of a changing climate intersect with pre-existing crises of poverty and violence. Climate change acts as an accelerant, like gasoline thrown on a fire, intensifying and worsening social conflicts. He sees this catastrophic convergence occurring most intensely in mid-latitude regions of the world, between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, hence the title, Tropic of Chaos. Parenti examines case studies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and through these examinations reveals the mechanisms by which climate crisis in the countryside are expressed in the cities in the form of urban violence. Regions ravaged by drought and flash floods supply their urban slums with new inhabitants who find little to no social infrastructure and a good deal of state repression enacted by the police. Parenti's accounts reveal that the relationship between climate change and violence is complex. His accounts also resonate with an important point made by Levy and Siddell in their review, that much of the morbidity and mortality associated with climate-induced violence is structural in its origin. It results from the breakdown in health-supporting infrastructures that provide essential resources such as food, water, sanitation, and medical care. A recent example of this catastrophic convergence of poverty, violence, and climate change is occurring today in the country of Syria. Since March of 2011, a violent and bloody civil war has been churning in Syria, where multiple factions are fighting the armed forces of the government of Bashar al-Assad. In January of 2015, the United Nations estimated that 220,000 people have been killed in the conflict, an enormous number for a conflict that is only 3 years old. From the outside, the Syrian conflict seems like an extension of the Arab Spring, a wave of social unrest that was motivated by a desire for democratic reform and which swept across countries in Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia. But a recent paper by Peter Gleek traces the relationship between water and climatic conditions in the region and Syria's escalating social conflict. This region of the world has seen conflict over water for thousands of years. More recently, over the last 25 years, Syria itself has seen enormous pressure on its water resources due to drought and population growth. Beginning in 2006 and lasting up until the breakout of violence, Syria experienced an extreme period of drought spanning multiple growing seasons and spawning agricultural failures. Close to 1 million people lost their livelihoods and food supports. Roughly 1.5 million people were displaced from rural areas to cities where unemployment and social unrest flourished. The influx of young, unemployed men combined with the scarcity of food and water and the brutal repression of protests by Bashir al-Assad's government, sparked a violent armed resistance and civil war. This conflict has also provided a willing population of recruits for the Islamic State, currently seeking to establish control over territory in the region. Syria can be seen as a flashpoint for a growing social conflict that is destabilizing the region. Here it is hard to discount or separate the impacts of climate variability from what has become a global security issue. So, in summary, does climate change contribute to the risk of violence? I think we can say, with a good deal of certainty, that based on events of the past and events unfolding before our eyes, it does. Bye for now.